The red-haired man met, and compared to the warrior, the girl was very small. Alexandra raised her head up and looked at the beautiful face that looked down at her. The princess looked up at him with big violet eyes in surprise and wondered if this was her husband. She heard that Theodore would meet her at the entrance gate. She thought that this man had the highest status in Arugo. The girl also thought that firstly, she could give credit for her face. Living here, she would not complain about it. When the red-haired man suddenly bowed and greeted Her Highness the Princess, she thought he had a pleasant voice. Moreover, it was nice that he was so courteous and not embarrassed by her appearance, Sasha thought. Something confused her a little here. She wondered if he was too polite with her. The man said that he had been assigned to accompany her and introduced himself by the name James, leaving no doubt that he was lower in status than her. Suddenly the princess looked around and asked the warrior where her future husband was. James replied that he had gone hunting. The girl exhaled tiredly and thought that his bride had arrived and he had gone hunting, a sign that their life would not be too good. Tiredly, she lowered her head, and raising her again, the princess began to speak. The man drew attention to her. She suggested quite seriously that it seemed to her that her future husband was very embarrassed about her. All the men led by Prince Theodore were horrified and very shocked by such a statement about their master. James hastened to correct the situation and awkwardly said that this was not so, but that monsters had simply appeared unexpectedly. And while the men were moving away from the embarrassment of Mr. Alexandra, she thought that it was just a hunt. Now she understood why he left his post. After all, he was called to fight urgently. Then the girl was very interested in this question, and raising her head, she asked why he didn't tell her right away. Bowing his head, the man explained that she only asked where he was, so he gave a simple answer. It's true, he was not going to lie to her, and then the princess, bowing a little, said that you cannot deceive a person with a pure lie. Raising her head, Alexandra said that even a half-truth can become an answer that will fool another. The man shuddered. She thought that at the first meeting, it is better to show yourself on the good-natured side. You need to smile and not insist on an answer. Although she didn't think about it, but here everything is different from her stay in the Empire. No longer need to bow down. People being wary and hating her, in other words, not expecting anything from her, means she doesn't need to live up to their expectations. And after reasoning, she, smiling, told Mr. James in future it would be better for him not to fool her. The man's eyes widened instantly. He never expected the girl to answer him like that. He looked carefully and realized that even on her dirty face, her eyes glowed like stars, he thought. A blush appeared on the man's cheeks. It seemed to him that she had shot him right in the heart. The princess was completely different from her expectations. The maid and the knight loudly asked the barbarians what they were talking about. How dare they call their princess dirty, and who were they to ask the princess to put on Irugo's clothes before even entering the palace? This was a reaction to James, who recommended that the princess wash herself and change her clothes before entering the palace, before that they were not worried at all. But now they are starting to quarrel. In response to this, James took a step back, sighing heavily to avoid a quarrel since the king was not there. But be that as it may, the people from Irugo, in this case a man with a scar on his face, paid attention to her. And they treated her with respect and reverence despite the people who arrived with her. When the man with dark purple hair bowed to her, she looked at him in surprise and waved back. A warrior with dark hair asked if he would leave everything like this, because people from Sylvanus were going to start a quarrel. James sighed heavily and said that nothing could be done about it. He explained that the prince wanted a complete end to the war. The political marriage would not be dissolved, but the rumors would fall on Theodore's shoulders. That is why, at least they should not stir up controversy. The man thought about it and said that it was difficult. By the way, the guy who was reasoning earlier suddenly said he didn't expect the princess to be like this. James shuddered. The man with brown hair said that he liked her. He was surprised by her courage. The brunette agreed with him, and the red-haired one told them not to be too kind to them. He believed that the Sylvans might have sent an assassin when suddenly he looked forward and what he saw amazed him. In front of the palace there were carriages. The coat of arms of the third Prince Michael, the coat of arms of the first Princess Patricia, Mrs. Elizabeth, Mrs. Samira. The man sadly thought that they had decided to conduct reconnaissance. In fact, Mr. Theodore could not come to meet the bride because of the monsters, but he was interested in why other royals were messing around. When the girl said in surprise that Sylvanus's carriages had arrived and they looked gorgeous, She thought what kind of person she was. The others didn't even know how to answer this correctly, and the man said that the Sylvans were just trying to look like that. With the help of the knights, she calmly got out of the carriage when she looked up. But she discovered that all eyes were directed directly at her. It became slightly uncomfortable. Inquisitive eyes that examined the princess from head to toe. Countless glances rush at her like spears and arrows. They meet a bride from a distant land and say that this is what was expected of a low-born wife living up to her name. They were waiting for Princess Sylvanus, but she didn't even look like a beggar, the girl said, pursing her lips. Alexandra understood that they were simply overwhelmed with hostility. The red-haired maid mockingly asked if she really thought that if before Irugo, something would change. That's why she resisted so much. What a delight they had. She said that it was impossible to expect another reception. The girl with the scar said that now she would understand her place and be meek. All this time, James stood next to her and thought that people had come with her from their native lands and should protect her. He was outraged by what they were doing. Alexandra stood alone in front, and right behind her the others were laughing and whispering. The brilliant knight, holding various fabrics in his hands, watched with pleasure as they mocked the princess, when suddenly something snatched the fabric from his hands. The knight screamed loudly what he was doing, and whether he knew what kind of silk it was, he explained that it was a precious thing that could not be exchanged even for a chest of pure gold. Suddenly, the knight and the rest of those present fell silent, and the hands of the man who grabbed the fabric threw the silk over the princess. Unexpectedly strong hands instantly lifted her from the floor, taking her in his arms. This happened so quickly that Alexandra did not understand what had happened. Intuitively holding on to something, she looked at herself and wondered in surprise what kind of person it was and who had wrapped her in it. There were many questions. It was even interesting why she could not move, as if lost in space, when suddenly they pressed her hand to her body and the man asked, "So what?" He said in an impressive voice that the most valuable things should be given to his bride. The Knights of Sylvanus were surprised, and the Arugo Wars bowed. Now the girl began to understand what had happened, and raising her head up, she fixed her gaze on the man, and the golden snake eyes looked back at her. Alexandra looked at the man's face in surprise and admired his beautiful eyes. They sparkled like the sun's rays, that's how, she thought. So that was the kind of man Theodore was. The girl, looking at him with a cold gaze, thought that he was tall and realized that the inhabitants of Irugo are really so tall. Although he did nothing noteworthy, the proud Sylvans did not utter a word. The men looked at them menacingly. The prince, fearful and stuttering, said that they said his bride had arrived from Sylvanus. The girl behind him sharply turned her head away. The black-haired man with golden, snake-like eyes gave his brother and sister a dissatisfied look. But the next moment he simply turned around and headed towards the castle, carrying his future wife in his arms. Arriving in one of the rooms, he sat the girl down on the sofa, on a small pillow. Putting his hand on her belt, Theodore told her not to be mistaken, because he did this because he didn't really like the way his brothers and sisters were talking about her. The smile left his face, and the man with long hair explained that he didn't do it because she was pretty. Alexandra understood that this was natural, because this act was dangerous. If he liked him, she was like a lump of dust covered with sweat. She thought about what could be said about his preferences if she suited his taste. Meanwhile, the man ordered the servant to wash her. When the princess noticed the blood of monsters on his clothes, he was stained with it, even if it was not so noticeable on his black robe. She thought he was very dirty and covered herself with a cloth and said that they had not yet gotten married. The man was very surprised at these words from his bride, and the maid was no less shocked. An awkward silence hung between the ball of dust and the man in the blood. The girl wondered why he was looking at her like that, because she had to decide who would go wash first. Theodore grinned and said that he was not going to eat her after she washed herself and told her not to worry so much. Not a dirty girl like her. Alexandra asked what it meant to eat. Theo tisked. He was used to treating soldiers on the battlefield this way, and he just wanted to say that she was dirty and not to insult her. This is not how girls who grew up in beautiful castles are treated. He pulled himself away from the thought. Whether there was a misunderstanding or not, it doesn't matter. When Princess Alexandra raised her finger up and loudly announced that he was a pervert, the man was dumbfounded. He did not understand what she was saying at all, losing the sequence of everything. Leaning towards the girl, he said menacingly that he said that he would not eat her. Sasha replied that That is why it is not so important to them whether it is a dirty lump of dust or a person. Irritated, the prince said that she responded to his offer to bathe that they were not married. The princess denied. She meant that they could not bathe together yet, since they were not married. Theodore marveled and finally realized that she said that because they were not married. And while the girl persistently asked whether he would go to wash, because he was also dirty, the guy finally realized what her words meant, and putting his fingers to his forehead, said that he would wash in another place. The dust bunny looked at the dark-haired man in surprise, and she suddenly realized with embarrassment that this was normal, that there were several places for swimming in castles. She had lived in captivity for too long, so she had forgotten some points. Therefore, she quite easily jumped off the sofa where the groom had previously sat her down and said okay. The little ball of dust approached the maid, who had already been given the order, and asked to accompany her. The prince of the Irugo Empire watched the bride with interest and thought that this girl was a little strange. At first he thought she was crying, because if she was related by blood to the aristocrats of Sylvanus, then she grew up in a beautiful palace, and she was definitely not used to embarrassing situations, but she looked as if she had become emotionless because she was no longer able to be proud. He folded his hands thoughtfully on his chest and thought that he didn't understand why she was so dirty, and yet he didn't even focus on the woman he was being passed off as. Alexandra, accompanied, arrived at the bath and was surprised that there was warm water and even a bath. She hoped that the water would not be too cold, but in fact, the bath was with warm water. Sasha was happy. Suddenly, 3 ladies entered the room and bowed, and told the princess that they would help her. She had not been treated like this since early childhood. Business demeanor and professional approach, the maids were interested in everything and talked about everything they would do. The princess had only met maids who constantly ignored her, so such respectful behavior was unusual for her. This meant that her future husband was resourceful and charismatic. It was good that their negotiating opponent had such abilities. And while she thought that she had to win her husband over to her side, the maids suddenly stopped in amazement. The princess didn't understand what was happening and finished, and they turned around and asked if there was something wrong. The maid looked at her in fascination and thought about her mystically violet eyes, like a dawn, sparkling silver hair. But the next moment she came to her senses and, together with 2 other girls, bowed and said that it was not so. She apologized. Having omitted this incomprehensible event, Alexandra climbed into a warm bath, realizing how wonderful it all was. The maids helped her rinse her hair a few more times, and then she sent them away and decided to postpone all plans for later. Suddenly, the water in the reflection in front of her changed its color to a denser one, reminiscent of outer space. In such a situation, knowledge should appear. The splash of water is a sign of activation of the Emperor's eye. She thought what she would see. The eyes of the first princess of Sylvanus widened in surprise. The Emperor's eye showed her Theodore, which was surprising, and she thought, when this happens, he looks like his current self, which means either from the near future or the past. No matter how much he liked the design of these clothes, she thought, he would not continue to walk around in blood-stained clothes, and prayed that this would be the near past. She mentally begged her future husband and asked when he would go to wash. When they called out to His Highness Theodore, a girl with dark blue hair and a floral blue dress was walking straight towards the man the prince called her Diana. The girl asked what plunged him into such deep thoughts that he did not even notice her arrival. It was not like him. Looking away, the crown prince said that he was not thinking about anything. The next moment, she came closer to the prince, put her hand on his, and asked if he liked the princess. The girl looked at the reflection in surprise. She was amazed that